So thank you very much. This is the last session of today, and I wouldn't say it's the best, but I think that it's I'm on the top of the conference. I am pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Thomas Philippon. Thomas is currently the Max L. Hind Professor of Finance at the Stern School of Business of New York University. It is not an exaggeration to say that he is one of the brightest and the most talented economists of his generation, as his impressive academic and research curriculum attests. After having earned an MA in physics from École Polytechnique, any of you who is a French national or fellow traveler know what that means, a master in economics from the Paris School of Economics and a PhD in economics from MIT. He joined the faculty of NYU in 2003. And over the last 2 decades, Professor Philippon has held various visiting professors at some of the finest universities in the United States. He has advised the Financial Stability Board, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, as well as the French Minister of Finance and the ACPR, which is the French Prudential and Resolution Authority, among many other important responsibilities. Not least remarkably, our keynote speaker this afternoon has been the recipient of several prestigious prizes and distinctions awarded to young economists, including the Hermann Bernacer Prize, which, as many of you may know, is an award that here at the Banco of Spain we award annually to European young economists who have made outstanding contributions in the fields of macro and finance. Thomas' research interests are wide-ranging, spanning topics in the field of macroeconomics, corporate finance, business cycle, earnings, unemployment. So summing up, it is not by accident that Professor Philippon has crossed the Atlantic this week to deliver not one, but 2 keynote speeches in less than 48 hours, yesterday in Frankfurt at the ECB and today here in Madrid. So he's very hot on the market of keynote speakers. Today, Professor Philippon will address the design and implementation of a stress test for the banking sector. That, for those of you who pay attention to the initial discussion this morning by Governor Knott and Governor Escrivá, is a topic of increasing importance for central banks and supervisory authorities worldwide. We are eagerly waiting to hear your presentations over the next half an hour. And then we will open the floor for questions from you. So thank you very much.
All right, good afternoon. So first of all, you are way too kind. I'm not that hot on the market. What happened is I agreed to go to the ECB, and then somebody leaked that information, and then Rafa asked me to come, and I couldn't say no. So that's, and B, I think the last time I had the pleasure to be in Madrid was indeed for the Bernacer Prize, and I still have absolutely fantastic memories of that. So I already loved Madrid before, but ever more since then. And last point, oh, can I have a clicker or something? And last point, some people had the unfortunate honor, Jose Luis, for instance, to be at the ECB yesterday. So I was worried they would hear twice the same speech. But in part to avoid boring them to death, and in part because this conference has a stronger focus on stress testing, I decided to give you a bit of the overview that some people told me were useful yesterday. But then dive a little bit more into the details of stress testing. So it's going to be half of what I said yesterday and half new stuff. Okay, so the goal is to give you a framework for crisis resolution and stress testing. And I'm just going to emphasize the result that I found surprising when I did the research or when I read other people's research. And I'm going to try to emphasize that there are very strong links between micro and macro prudential. I would even go as far as to say that, we all remember in 2008 when we said, we were too focused on individual bank stability and not the system as a whole. And then I think that was an unfortunate consequence of thinking that there is such a thing as macro versus micro prudential. I plead 100% guilty. I was just like everybody. I was repeating the same mantra without thinking about it. I think it's deeply wrong, and I'll show you why. There's no difference. Okay, so I'm going to try to explain all of that and then talk about challenges, because it's kind of fun to talk about the past crisis, but it's more fun to think about the next ones, and so that's what we're going to do at the end. Okay, so let's start with what I think is like the baseline framework to think about these issues. So we want to think about ex ante, ex post, right? Ex ante is when we design stuff and when banks misbehave, and then ex post is when either they make money and nobody thinks about us, or the shit hits the fan and then the banks are desperate and everybody's blaming us for not seeing the crisis coming. All right, so I think that's a framework we're all familiar with. Okay, so in the crisis box there, I put market failures and interventions. So that's the first thing we need to discuss, which you can't discuss stress testing, in fact, or any type of regulation without specifying what is it that you're worried about and what is it you're going to do if something bad happens. So we're going to first, as usual in economics, we do backward induction, so we start by the end and we move back in time. So we're going to first do the square box, thinking about what's the mapping between market failures and interventions, and then think back about what we do at time zero, and then the linkages between the two. Now the first linkage, the one that we've thought about in the past and tried to implement regulation, is based on moral hazard, and that's the idea that whatever you end up doing in the square box at the bottom right, involving transfers from taxpayer to various institutions, so bailouts in general, is going to feed back into the time zero decision of banks or NBFI in terms of their risk taking, both micro level, so individual banks taking risk, or macro in the sense that you tighten the screw somewhere and then the risk goes somewhere else. Okay, so we're first going to analyze the black box, and that's where I'm going to be fast, because I spent a bit of time yesterday explaining the details, so there I'm just really going to give you the headlines. Okay, so I'll take a very neoclassical approach here, and I want to make essentially 1.5 points. The first half point is that I think we're all convinced now, so we'll just bear repeating only once, which is the right framework to think about that is no commitment. That is, there's no point thinking about regulations that you will not implement ex post, so the way you think about it is, if the crisis comes, you're going to do whatever it takes to solve it. Okay? You might have said the day before you would tie your hand and not do, and that doesn't work. Okay? It's not like Ulysses, we don't have a mast where we can just tie ourselves to, so I think that's obvious. Now the important point, I think, is to understand that there is a mapping between the thing you're trying to solve and the instrument you should be using. And if you think about it, I hope it's going to become less surprising afterward, but that mapping appears to be quite tight. So I'm going to think about 3 types of crisis: runs, debt overhang, lack of equity, whatever you want to call it, insolvency. And the third is some kind of market freeze because of adverse selection. Runs, I think it's pretty clear. We have one tool, which is some form of deposit insurance / liquidity support. So there's no point discussing that much further. I will go back to that when I talk about challenges going forward, because the thing that's kind of interesting is, I would argue we've had, we've been thinking about runs and we've been writing model about runs for a century and a half or something, but we never really had runs, to be honest. In the past, they were all freaking slow. So we call them runs because conceptually it's useful, but we never had runs. Like if it takes 20 days to move 20 billion, I don't call that a run. Okay, I think now we do have runs. Okay, post SVB. So I think that's something to talk about. But otherwise, I think that one is explored. So no point spending too much time on that. So debt overhang and adverse selection. Okay, so debt overhang, it turns out that, and again, hopefully that's going to be intuitive. So fundamentally, debt overhang is when a large class of credit assets become risky, which is the flip side of saying there is not enough equity supporting them. And so when you intervene in that market, it's not going to take the form of lending because there's already too much debt. Okay, so ex post efficient intervention against debt overhang always take the form of capital injection. So that's point number one. Point number two, you don't want to inject equity against nothing. So the question is against what? And it turns out that in a wide class of model we analyzed with Philipp Schnabel, the optimal solution is to inject equity against a mix of preferred stocks and warrants. Interestingly, successful interventions typically have used that. Why preferred stocks? Well, because you want to punish the shareholders, but you don't want to add debt overhang, so you don't want to, worsen the debt issue. So you want to be in between, right? Junior to the debt, but senior to the shareholders. And then why the warrants? Well, because you want to give money to the taxpayer. And so if you're successful, and in fact, in a benchmark debt overhang model, the government can make money. Because if you unclog the system, solve the debt overhang, asset prices are going to go back up, and if you position yourself correctly, you can net out a profit. And to get that profit, though, you need to have a claim on the upside, and that's why you want warrants. So you can formalize all of that, but that's the cost minimizing. That's what gets you to the Pareto frontier. Okay, what about adverse selection? So adverse selection, it's a bit different. Okay, so it's a market that's freezing because people don't trust each other, and then the cost of fund is so high that good types decide that they'd rather wait. Okay, and in the market you only have the bad type. So that's a classic lemon market. Now there it's a little bit more subtle, but thankfully it's the big principle still works. So the reason it's more subtle is if you're in a world of asymmetric information, then every action has a signaling component, okay? And that means when the government designs a program, who self-selects into the program becomes a very important, in fact, we just mentioned that earlier about the CCYB. Anything you do becomes a signal, okay? And so in fact, in this case, if you design any government program, you're gonna have banks deciding whether to use the government money or not, and you have outside investors watching what's going on. If a bank decides to join the government program or not, it's going to be interpreted by the market as a signal of whether the bank is strong or weak. Okay? Now you could imagine two cases. One is when the bad apples go to the government, the good apples stay in the market, and then, so then in a sense that's good because then the market becomes more efficient. Right? In fact, you're going to get rid of the adverse selection in the market. So the private market is going to go back to functioning, but then the government is going to end up with all the bad apples, so it might be super costly for the government. Or you can flip it, saying, well, suppose it's the other way. Suppose the good guys go to see the government, and then the bad guys stay in the market. Well, it's not clear it's going to be great either, because unless you really have a very strong participation, you're still going to have adverse selection in the private market, so you're not solving the market freeze. You do end up with the good apples. So for the government, that may be less costly. It turns out that none of that matters very much once you design the program optimally. So what's the conclusion there? First, the optimal instrument is debt guarantee or direct lending. So why is that? Well, I can show you the math, but I think the deeper intuition is, it's a bit like in if you write like a second best program, you try to make sure that you give the government the exact same constraint as the private sector. Right? You're not assuming the government can do better or worse. That's the same thing here. So fundamentally, the government is trying to solve the same problem as the private sector, which is one of asymmetric information. And we know what the private sector solution is. That's why they create debt contracts. Okay? So because the privately optimal solution is to use debt contract, the socially optimal intervention tool is also going to be a debt contract. Okay? That's kind of the very high-level intuition. The math is not easy, but I think that's the high-level intuition. So you're going to use debt contract, and typically either debt guarantees or direct lending by the authorities. Usually these two are equivalent. And then what's interesting? Well, the first thing that's interesting is the efficiency of the intervention and the cost of the intervention has literally nothing to do with the size of the program. I mean, literally. So how much you actually end up lending is completely irrelevant for how much it's going to cost and for its efficiency. All that matters is that's conditional on using the right instrument. If you don't use the right instrument, you get screwed all over, of course. But conditional on using the right instrument then the sufficient statistics for the success of the operation is what you do to private prices. So are you lowering the private cost of fund? That's what's going to determine both the cost and the efficiency of the intervention. And the final surprising thing is you don't need to shut down the markets. So because in this world, you see, you could imagine, well, it's such a pain in the neck that these guys are watching. And so if I could just shut down the private market for a little bit, then I wouldn't have to worry about banks signaling to their investors, and that's why they don't want to join. So if I just suspend temporarily the private market, so I don't have the signaling issue, it's a legitimate question. It turns out, and that's where it's kind of very subtle, that it actually doesn't help. You don't get better. You don't need to shut down the private market. Okay. So, big lesson number one, appropriate tools. Optimal instruments align with the market failure. So against runs, you do deposit insurance. Against debt overhang, you do equity injections. Against warrants, against credit freeze, you do debt guarantees or direct lending. Okay? Notice something that's peculiar here, which is asset purchases are very rarely a good idea. Now, of course, you'd say, well, that's probably because the bankers always ask for asset purchases. Well, that's the reason, because it's not optimal. So if you do an asset purchase, you're going to end up transferring more money to the banks for the same welfare benefit. So it is in their private interest to ask for asset purchase, but in this wide class of model, it is not optimal for the government to do that. I can talk later about counterexamples where actually you could use some asset purchase, but not in this class. Okay, so that's big lesson number one. Big lesson number two is going to be about the fact that these are still like, you have one nail, one hammer, but the real world is more interesting than that. And in particular, there is no room in any of these for either asset quality reviews ex post or stress test ex ante, because we haven't specified like information set. And so the thing that's interesting is to think about, okay, suppose the government can do all of that, that is, can use its balance sheet, but also provide information. Then what changes? And it turns out a lot of things change. Okay, so let's do the first one. This one actually, interestingly, was motivated by what happened in Spain. Because I remember talking to American regulators and complaining about the fact that the first batch of EU stress tests were weak. And I was like, yeah, okay, you're right, but think about it. Like, why is it that you ran a very relatively aggressive stress test in the spring of 2009? Do you think it has something to do with the fact that the Treasury pre-positioned the money and told you that, be honest, and if it turns out the result is bad, we will back you out. We have the money set aside. Now, suppose you didn't have that luxury. Would you have run a tough stress test? No, but that's what the Spaniards are doing. They are not crazy, And so I think that's what got me thinking about that. And that actually simple extension has very interesting, surprising consequences. So all we do is we do run versus adverse selection. So it's like literally Diamond Dybvig meets Akerlof, exactly. And then we have two tools for the government, which is the usual bailouts. And you've seen before the kind of optimal instrument. So that's going to apply here. So the optimal tax or balance sheet instrument for the government is going to be a mixture of DI and debt guarantees. Okay. But then he has this extra tool, which is to disclose information. Okay. Now, I don't call that a stress test because this is ex post. You're already in the crisis. You're trying to calm the market down. So I would call that an asset quality review. Okay. And I think it's misleading to call that a stress test because you're not designing scenarios. You're already in the deep doo-doo and you're like, okay, I'm trying to figure out how bad it is. So what happens then? Well, the trade-off now, especially in this country, should be obvious, which is if you disclose information, you might be able to unfreeze the credit market because essentially you told the private sector, these are the good guys, you can lend to them at a reasonable spread. So then these guys are going to go borrow, lend, and invest. Okay? The problem is all the bad guys you singled out are all going to be run on. Okay? So then what happens? Well, the trade-off is the more information you disclose, at least over some range, the better it's going to be for the private credit market, but the higher is the risk of a run. So what happens then? Well, what happens is exactly the intuition we had from earlier, which is having access to a deep balance sheet on the government is like an insurance policy. So if you don't know in advance what the stress test or the AQR is going to deliver, But if you know that if the results are bad, you have the balance sheet to stabilize the system, you're de facto, it's almost equivalent to having a lower risk aversion as a regulator. So you're more willing to take the risk. Say, okay, I'm going to take the risk. I'm going to run a very tough stress test, and I'm going to publicly disclose the results. And if it turns out the results are bad, I will use my balance sheet to stabilize the system. Sounds intuitive, okay? But the first thing it does is rich governments do better, in the sense that they spend less taxpayer money in equilibrium. Okay? And to me, that was always the thing that I thought made no sense in the, or made little sense in the first generation models of moral hazard. They always had this very, very strong prediction that if you could just tell the government not to spend anything, or if a government is so constrained it can't spend anything, then in equilibrium it's going to do better. And I just think it's not true. And so that's one reason, which is in this world, a rich government, and remember, this is no commitment. So it's not that they can commit. They have the money. They could spend it. But there is a better tool. It's just that this tool is risky, and therefore you only use it if you have a big balance sheet. But I think that's a good prediction, actually. So in that world, it becomes inefficient to restrict government bailout options exposed. You can still restrict the tools they could use, all kinds of stuff. But the idea that you put an upper bound on how much money they can spend actually is inefficient. It's inefficient in the sense that not only you're going to have worse crisis, but you're going to end up spending more money, not less. Okay, so related to that is another thing that where I changed my mind a little bit. I always thought that the too big to fail was hopeless, precisely because I think the only reasonable framework is no commitment. Okay, so how can you believe that banks are big and the system cannot be led to fail, no matter what you say ex ante? How can you believe that and at the same time believe that we can do something about too big to fail? And I think I've changed my mind in part on that because it's all about how do you go from losses and bailouts back to moral hazard? Okay, and essentially the feature of all the first generation models is they have one bank or one representative bank. So in that world, how much money you spend exposed is a sufficient statistic for how much money you create, how much more hazard you create ex ante. It's like almost one-to-one, right? You're going to give them money in the bad state of the world, they're going to take more risk. And by how much? Well, proportional, or at least the increasing function of how much you give them exposed. So you only need to worry about the total amount of money you're going to spend, or total taxpayer loss. I also think that's completely wrong. Because the way to think about it is you have many banks, or at least several. And private incentives are not a function of the aggregate size of the pot, but how much they get individually. So imagine a world where you have 5 banks. So A, B, C, D, E, these are the names of the banks. So literally they identified the banks. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's the ranking of the banks in the crisis. Okay? And of course, they don't know where they're going to end up. So bank C, for instance, might end up being the top dog. And then bank D might end up being the worst performing bank. Okay. Now suppose you have a policy that says, I'm going to shoot the red one. And that's it. That's your policy. That's all there is to it. Then we can talk about credibility after. But that policy would actually have a big impact on private incentives because nobody would want to be number 5. So in fact, you would engineer a race to the top in that case. Now, if you formalize, what matters really is green minus red, which is how much do you reward bank 1 versus how much you punish bank 5. Okay. Now that's a cross-sectional object. It is not the same as the average amount of money you're spending. It's the distribution that matters. And this allows you to make big progress on too big to fail. Okay? So I guess let me just one question. Why? Because so take the simple case where you have this bank 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are perfect substitutes with one another, and you don't have limited liability. Then almost literally, you can commit to shooting down the worst performing banks. This is not shutting down the system because the other 4 are still there. They're going to take over the business. So you're actually not shutting down the system. And that's going to create great incentives. Now, if if you have limited liability, you will have to reward green and punish red at the same time. Okay. But you will still get rid of moral hazard, even though you are bailing out the system exposed. So again, there will be no connection, or there will be little connection between how much you are spending exposed and the amount of moral hazard you're creating ex ante. Distribution matters, and this works only to the extent that you can actually, shut down the worst performing, and that only works if you have good micro-prudential tools. Okay, so that's a big thing. I'm going to come back to that, but that doesn't work if you don't have a way of merging banks, if that's efficient. Okay, so that's a case where having good micro tools, literally being able to change the pieces at the micro level, is the way of solving the macro moral hazard. So that's what I mean when I say I think the prudential macro and micro are kind of two sides of the same coin. They are not that different. Okay, so let's speed up a bit. So let's talk about stress test. So when you think about stress testing, now you're thinking about this bottom left part that feeds into various places. If you have a good stress test, you're going to be ready for the intervention. That's the first thing. The second thing is you're going to try to measure what these guys are doing and limit their risk taking. And then doing so, you're also going to change the probability of a crisis. Okay. So now let's dive a little bit into what that means and how you do it. So I think as of now, we're doing stress testing for two separate reasons. One is to set capital requirement. The other one is to learn and do risk management. So we're going to focus on the learning and risk management part, and then go back to asking whether there's a tension with the second one. Okay, so what's stress testing in my view? Well, it's three parts. You have the scenario design, then you have to project the numbers, and then you disclose the results. Okay, so disclosure, stuff like that we've discussed before, that's part of the run versus lemon. So I'm going to focus on the first box, which is scenario design. So in the paper with Cecilia, we solved that problem, essentially. We tell you how you design the scenario. So a little bit of notation just so you know how it maps. So that's the only slide with stuff on it. So I'm thinking of a world where you have a bunch of macro risk factors, J. And so the factors are S. They are like states of the world. Okay? So in the simplest case, you think of S1 is GDP, S2 is the VIX, S3 is the exchange rate, and stuff like that. Equivalently, if you run a macro model of like the type of macro model we saw in the previous session, then the S's would be structural shocks, and then you would back out the other guys from it. Okay. And then the key thing is these are the things that determine, to some extent, the losses by the banks. Let's Y be the loss by bank I instead S. It's going to be S times X plus eta. Eta is just noise, because we have always noise, so I put it there. But the thing that's important is X. So X is the vector of exposures that the banks have. And the key is that you don't know what X is. Okay? You know it exists, you know they have exposure to different types of risk, but you don't know. So the name of the game is to guess what X is. Okay? And stress testing then becomes a tool to ask questions about the bank. The questions are the counterfactual P&L they would have in different scenarios. And using these questions, you learn about X. Okay? And then you specify some welfare function for what it is you care about. So typically something like you don't want your system to be undercapitalized, so you have some target capital ratio, and then you subtract the losses. Okay? So this, as it turns out, you can write it as a Kalman filter, but on its head, in a sense. Okay? Which is you're designing the input so you maximize your learning. Okay? So it's a little bit like, it's almost the opposite of what you would do if you thought about like the real world. Okay? Because in the real world, you just have stuff happening and you're trying to update. Here is you creating the stuff, you're creating the scenario to maximize. Okay? So you input, so when there's a hat on something, it means it's not a real world. It's not GDP falling 10%. It's your scenario saying GDP falls 10%. Yeah, I'm going to go a bit over time, I can tell you already. So, so you input scenarios, and then you ask the banks to report losses. Okay, that's the baseline. That's the baseline bottom-up. I'll talk about top-down afterwards. And then you learn. So what is learning here? Well, conditional, remember, what you want to learn about is X, the exposure. So now you have a distribution of X conditional on what you've learned. What you've learned is the result the banks give you, which is their P&L or estimated P&L Y hat. But you also know what you ask them. So condition on Y hat and S hat, you have learning about X. And you learn about the mean and the distribution of X. Okay? And then you take actions based on that. The actions, so to be simple here, we go two broad classes of action. One is essentially a capital requirement, or like a broad-based LTV, which it hits everybody. And another one is a targeted action, like a prompt corrective action. Okay, so just to think of it as tier 1 versus PCA. Okay. So you learn, and then you take appropriate action. Okay, so what we do is we solve that thing here. We solve the pink stuff in the middle, which is what are the questions you should be asking? What are the optimal scenarios to learn about the underlying exposures? Okay, and then this is one of the punchlines. So bear with me once. So there is a bit of information on that slide. It's not as horrible as you think. So on the vertical axis, I have the welfare gain from being able to run stress tests. Okay, and it's measured in units of tier 1 capital, in the sense that if the stuff on the left is 100% or 1, it means it's equivalent. Running a stress test gives you the same boost in welfare as having 1 unit of tier 1 for free. Okay? So that's why we scale the utility gain. So you can relate to stress testing versus capital requirement. And on the horizontal axis is the amount of uncertainty in your economy. So first thing that's obvious is these curves are very convex. Okay, so stress test, that would be obvious, but like it's quantitatively is going to be very true. More uncertainty increases the value of stress testing a lot. Okay, if there's little uncertainty, you just gain nothing. The second thing is if you compare the left and the right panels, the scales are very different. On the left, it goes from 1 to 7%. On the right, it goes up to 40%. Okay, so what's the difference? Well, the difference is on the left, all you can do in response to a stress test result is adjust the capital requirement. And that's just not that useful. There's just not that much information you can gain that's going to make you change your mind about this very broad level stuff. Okay. So if all you're going to do after a stress test is to change capital requirement, then a stress test is not that useful. And why? Because intuitively, you're never going to go to the extreme. You're always going to stand, depending on how you define it, but like 15% or something like that. Okay. So there's no point learning something that the answer is going to be 15% no matter what. On the right, the curve that shoots up is the curve where you have plus intervention. So that's the case where you have something like a PCA. The key difference there is if you learn something from the stress test, in your toolkit to respond, you also have the option of doing a targeted intervention, either on a specific bank or on a specific market or a specific class of borrowers. So that's the key. Learning from stress tests is useful only to the extent that you can have a targeted intervention. Otherwise, you're mostly wasting your time, as far as learning is concerned. Okay? The other thing you can see is the other curves are quite close to each other, and the other curve, what they have is they speak to the tension between using stress tests for setting tier 1 ratios. So when you have 2 free, that means you're free to choose 2 scenarios. And the curve right below with the little circle is 1 fixed, 1 free. That means you're already using up 1 scenario as your baseline for, your normal adverse for setting the tier 1. So you don't, and that's one is not very free. You only have 1 scenario where you can explore more like crazy stuff. It turns out that 1 is almost good enough. Okay? All right. So lesson from stress testing. Again, the micro-macro is key. Like stress testing, there's big stuff with this big macro exercise we do. The information content of it is useful only if you have good micro tools. Okay? So I think that's a big theme, this micro-macro stuff. And then you need to ask the right question. Okay, so since I'm running low on time, I'm going to quickly talk about the new stuff, or the more speculative stuff. I'm not repeating what's at the top. I said it already. Now, what are the challenges? I think that going forward, we're going to have 3 types of challenges, or maybe 2.5. So one has to do with speed and segmentation, one with market power, and the third with conflict with other objectives, either monetary or fiscal. So the time stuff, the speed stuff, I think is pretty obvious. Like everything we've talked about so far assumes that you can get to the weekend. Okay? Assume that if the crisis hits on Wednesday, you can actually implement all of this stuff over the weekend. And it was very true until SVB. Problem is, it's not true anymore. Combination of market, apps, online, social media, whatever you want. But the fact is, now the runs are actually runs. They go very fast. Another one which is similar to that is the LDI crisis in the UK, where there what happened is private capital was just so freaking slow to move. That crisis on paper should have been absolutely privately resolved. Yeah, all you had to do was move money from one pocket to the other. If you could think about the LDI guys and the insurers and the pension on the wall together. And it took them, they said, oh, it's going to take us 3 weeks to move the money around. So there is like the slowness of the private capital that actually forced the central bank to do something. But in both cases, that means the speed becomes an issue. Market power and concentrated market, they actually makes things worse. Because most of the time, so market power concentration means that these private agents are going to behave strategically. And most of the time, what that's going to mean is going to play against you. Because strategic players are going to slow down the help. So that's the Rajan Diamond huge paper, but that we saw also in the case of the LDI in the UK. The hedge funds are like, oh, we're going to wait until that hit rock bottom, and then we're going to come in. We're not going to, why come in earlier? You know. So if they were not strategic, that would not happen, because they were trying to front run each other. But if they are strategic, they know there are few of them, and maybe they collude in the background, I don't know. But then you can just say, we're going to wait for the crisis to be really bad, the price is very low, and then we're going to come in and earn a few billion pounds, which they did. And they speed up the risk on the other hand. Okay, so concentrated market is like you lose on both sides. The help is going to come more slowly, and then the risk is going to speed up because of predatory trading. Okay, so that implication is it makes the stress test more important, right? In that world, you need to run the right stress test because speed and segmentation are kind of almost the same if you think about it. Speed means when you send the money matters, and fragmentation means where you send the money matter. But in fact, sometimes this segregation is also along the dimension of trading speed. So you need to use the stress test more efficiently in this world because you need to be ready. And I think it also has a third role, which is usually we think of stress testing as, well, we have one baseline scenario or one adverse, or whatever you want to call it, where we use it. It has to be realistic, so it's not exploratory, and you use it to set the tier 1 ratios. Then you have another one, hopefully, where you can ask more like crazy questions so you can learn something new. Okay. And these are the two uses of stress testing that we discussed so far. I think in this world there is a third one, which is like credible prepositioning. If you have run the right stress test, you've already thought about the tools you would be able to implement. Okay? Now, in the world where you could get to the weekend, it makes no difference because between Wednesday and Friday evening, you have enough time to think about the tools. But in the new world where speed actually matters, it's better if you think about the tools in advance. And the only way you can think about the right tools is by running the right stress tests. Okay? And it's true on the financial side. I think it's even more true on the political side, which is if you're going to have to lend a lot of money very quickly, it's going to help a lot if you run the stress test that correspond to that scenario, because there you could argue, look, we thought it could happen. We crunched the number. These guys are solvent in that scenario. They're just illiquid. So it's okay for me to run and lend them very quickly a lot of money. Okay? But if you haven't done the homework before, you're going to have a massive political backlash if you try to do it quickly. Because they're going to ask you, oh, no, don't do it quickly. First, make sure that they are actually solvent but illiquid. So I think that this pre-positioning, both financially and politically, is a third role for stress testing in this new world. And the last thing I want to talk about is top-down versus bottom-up. So there is clearly a case for, Klaas said that this morning, the governor of the Dutch Central Bank, that he wants having this top-down stuff because it's more nimble. I think it's absolutely correct. You can have more scenarios and you can include more players. So I think there is no question that this is something that should be developed. And hopefully the framework I showed you earlier is almost like plug and play. So you specify what you care about, what you're worried about, and then it's going to create the scenarios for you that correspond to this. But I think the bottom-up part, we should not discard it completely. Because at the end of the day, one of the key things with the bottom-up is it is one of the very few exercises, and maybe that's why the banks don't like it, by the way. It's one of the very few exercises where it balances a little bit the information advantage, or rather the information disadvantage of the government. Because for the first time, you're going to get in answers from the different banks, and you can compare across banks what they say. And it's harder to find a better way to find who's cheating, you know? Because if they give you two different answers to the same question, even though you think a priori their business models are similar, you might be suspicious. And it is very hard to learn that in any other way. So I think the great virtue of the bottom-up is precisely to test something like either somebody is lying or even without being too negative about it, just like they have different models, and it's about model robustness. Okay? But that's not something you would get from the top down. So in that sense, I think it's very important to keep running the... last thing, and then, yeah, so my last slide. So now the question is, are these things going to conflict with other stuff you want to do? So monetary policy or fiscal policy? With monetary policy, I think the issue is we've seen is central banks no central bank ran scenarios with high inflation. That's obviously crazy, you know, if you think from a Bayesian perspective, but we also know why. Okay, you know, suppose you come up with a scenario with very high uncontrolled inflation, then you're the central bankers. People are going to interpret that as you're admitting you don't know what you're doing. So that there is a tension, clearly. The second one with fiscal policy, I think is going to become more important, which is, I think, the main source of financial risk over the next 5 years by a wide margin. I mean, after Putin, it's fiscal policy. So, you know, so many countries, the US first, are running completely unsustainable fiscal policies. So many candidates in many countries, including mine, have totally crazy ideas about what they would do if they were elected. That's the major source of financial risk. But it's clear that it's going to be very hard for a central bank to run a public scenario. Maybe privately, top-down, yes, if you do it quietly. But bottom-up, there's no way you're going to publish a scenario where things go haywire because your government is running an irresponsible fiscal policy. And yet, that is a question you would like to ask. But you can't, because it's too dangerous for a central bank. So one suggestion is, I think there's be a stronger role for having kind of delegate that thing a little bit. So you're not bearing the responsibility for creating the scenario. And having some kind of independent advisor for the scenarios would be useful in that world. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much for it was quite clear and inspiring. So if you want, we can open the floor to collect some questions. So the first question there. Oops.
Thank you, Thomas. That was, frankly, a great presentation. I learned a ton. Let me just put forward a couple of things that are unclear to me. They sound intuitive, but I'm not sure I understand them properly. The first one was when you proposed tournaments as a way of reducing moral hazard among banks. And we know that tournaments are never optimal as an incentive scheme unless we have a very, very weird situations. For example, if you are the last bank in the tournament, but just by a penny, obviously that is not the same that you are last in the tournament by a lot. That's an example of why tournaments don't reflect all the information. So I'm a bit surprised that you find that as an optimal suggestion. Maybe there is other assumptions I didn't see. The second observation, again, is a little bit of how general is your statement about market power is bad for market discipline. I can also think in situations in which you can use the fact that people have market power to make them internalize things that they don't internalize otherwise, and that could be useful. And finally, and perhaps because we have a president now that is completely unpredictable in the United States, or maybe in Spain, there is also some comment about how private uncertainty about public policy can be costly. But again, it can be useful as well. I mean, I can imagine public policy that is subject to mixed strategies under certain circumstances that could be helpful. Again, it's a little bit of, are you sure that those things are general or they are intuitive and specific to your particular environments?
Should we collect a second question here, and then no, here. Okay, we will collect all and then.
Yes. So on the point on that the stress test to be super fast, you recommend that you have to give the money super fast, like in the case of United States in 2009, different from Europe. It seems extremely similar to the deposit insurance. Let's forget about Silicon Valley Bank. In the past, FDIC was unique in the world that they promised to give you the money on the following day. Once they promise you that, people don't run, and that's why we didn't see runs in the United States. So is it very similar to that? Because it looks like identical. And then when you said that, say, QE or asset purchases are not, are inefficient, maybe in systems like the euro area, in which you don't issue euros, so you don't have that credibility, then maybe promises like the Draghi in July 2012, or the TPI, this was the ONT, or the TPI in the COVID, might be optimal. It's a way of becoming, of promising that money immediately.
Thank you. There was a question there.
Thank you for this interesting keynote. I felt that in a way there was a contradiction between the premise that you laid out at the beginning of you can't commit as an authority not to intervene in a crisis, and then later when you have this tournament with the banks where you say you let the worst bank fail. So perhaps you can elaborate on that tension. Also in that context, you stress the importance of what you call microprudential tools to deal with that bad bank. But in a way, if you mean that you want to improve resolvability of a failed bank, to me, in a way, that's macro-pru, right? And you want to be able to deal with the interconnectedness of that bank and all the efforts that have been undertaken in this regard to deal with SIFIs since the GFC. To me, they have a macroprudential connotation or dimension that's very important. Thank you.
There were Federico there and Carlos here. Yeah, because maybe
thanks for the keynote. A couple of questions. So the first one is about the signaling information effect when you implement a new macroprudential measure. You talked about 3 of them, and so I was simply wondering, is this something we should be worried about whenever you implement a new stress test, and this might be a coordinating device for markets to panic about a certain aspect. The second point is instead about stress tests themselves. I feel like you only talked about whether to run them or and disclose all the results or not run them at all. I was wondering whether there is cases in which only disclosing partially the results is actually optimal or can help. Thank you.
I'm gonna forget the question if I. Let's do a second round after. Okay, so great questions, all of them. Okay, so let's start with the tournament question. There were 2 separate questions on the tournament part. So why is it optimal and why is it time consistent? Okay, in fact, the 2 are connected. So I said tournament because it's the intuitive way to do it, but you design the payoff structure. So you don't have to, if the last one fails by epsilon, the punishment can also be continuous in that. But the key thing is that it depends on the cross-section. And typically the way you would do it is depend in a continuous way, so it's not like you don't punish for epsilon. But the key is you play one against the other, and that's the critical part. And that to me is the key nature of the tournament. It's a relative performance evaluation. Okay, so maybe the technical way to do it is you do a relative performance evaluation, but it's going to look like a tournament. And then there's going to be a winner and a loser. And so in the case where the green and the red are separate, like the prime example of something that works well is the bad bank is performing very poorly, and you want the more healthy bank to just take it over. Okay. So then the question becomes, One, do you have the tools to do that? So that to me is the connection with the micro, which is you need good tools to do that. You need A, to be able to wipe down the shareholders of the red bank to zero. And that's not so easy to do, as we saw in practice. So that's a good tool. And then you have the tool for merging them, okay? With all the technical part in the background, from the IT to the counterparties in various derivatives. So to me, these are all micro-prudential in the sense that they are like, can you do it in practice, like technically? If the answer is yes, then that becomes credible. See, this is the key. Then it becomes credible, because that's actually, you are happy to do that. It is ex-post efficient to do that, so you're going to do it. But it's also good for incentives. And in fact, it goes further. It is okay to give money to green. It is okay to give green a first loss protection against the assets of red. If green is saying, oh my God, okay, fine, I could buy red, but there is this balance is complicated, there might be hidden losses in there, I'm worried. If the government says, okay, I'm going to give you protection, so the first losses are on us, is that moral hazard? Well, no, it's not. It is not moral hazard, because it's something you get only if you're green. So that works, actually. And that's exposed Pareto optimal, and therefore it is time consistent. Okay, so that's kind of the big answer on the tournament part. On the market power, yes, I agree. That one is, I went fast. There are cases where, essentially all the cases where market power could be good is like what is the story we tell about Canada. You have a few big banks, they have big margins, they have a reason to stay alive, and therefore they don't take, so it's like the franchise value. So anything, but then it's broader than that. You say, like, if you have good franchise value for reasons X, Y, Z, then it's good for stability. If one of these reasons happen to be market power, it's going to have a good effect via the franchise value. But I would put that in the broad category of franchise value, and I think honestly that there are ways to improve franchise value that are not necessarily linked to market power. So, but I agree with that, so absolutely. If market power improves franchise value, that channel is good. The other channels are going to be strategic, and they're always going to play against the government. The hedge funds have a strong incentive to wait. You know, like what did they do in the UK? They started trading at 7:30 in the morning, when the day the Treasury was going to start their program at 8:30 in the morning, and they make 4 billion out of it. They could have moved in Monday. They didn't. And if they were competitive, they would have. So that's why, like, and then the predatory trading, which is the thing you're worried about when that would speed up the risk. Same thing, predatory trading is one-to-one with concentration market power, their incentives. So in that sense, I think that it's more likely to be bad than good. And your last question was, what was it about public policy? So that's what I meant is in this world where, you know, the source of the risk is the government itself, at least in some countries, then this policy becomes tricky to think about. And to me, it's a bit like the conflict with fiscal policy more broadly. I mean, are you going to run a scenario where you say my government become crazy and start doing stuff that's going to move the market 20% up and down for no reason? I mean, that's a stress test which would be actually useful to run, but you know, you can't, because you can't ask that question if you're the part of the government. So, and that's what I meant. Okay, and then José Luis. So the FDIC, yes. So speed. So the FDIC had two great things actually. One is they were very fast, and so they would show up on Friday, shut the bank down, and on Monday you had your money back. So they would shut down the run. The other thing they did, which I learned writing the papers, is they actually implemented the green-red scheme. FDIC closure of banks is not based on the absolute performance of the bank. It's based on relative performance. If all the banks do poorly, they're going to shut down the worst performing, relatively speaking, and they're going to merge with the best performing. But that best performing might be worse performing than the worst performing was in the boom. That doesn't matter. That's very good for incentives. So I think that's the two things they had going for them. The only trouble they have now is they can't get to the weekend. So that's kind of I think that's the key issue. And then the asset purchase, so that's very important. So the asset purchase part, my claim was if you're trying to solve like a financial crisis, like a issue of equity in the private sector, in the private bank, undercapitalization, or a market freeze because of adverse selection like we had after 2009, then buying the asset is a bad idea. Buying a broad class of assets on which there is no asymmetric information, that is a different game, and that actually can be optimal. Okay. So buying a lot of gilt, like the fact that the Bank of England bought a lot of gilt, I think makes sense. The fact they did it in a way which was so predictable that they allowed the sharks to profit from it is less optimal in my view. Same thing with the Eurozone. The good thing with Draghi is that was actually a perfect one, because that was not predictable. See, he didn't say, oh, on Wednesday, I'm going to tell you something great that's going to solve the market. Because then, of course, all the hedge funds would have pre-positioned to benefit from, but he didn't do that. He announced, boom, whatever it takes. So I think that's kind of the key, and that is totally fine. It does bring at some point back the moral hazard question about, if the issue that is that the crisis is triggered by irresponsible fiscal policy, what is it you're going to do about it? Are you going to bail out the government or not? That question is still going to be there. Okay, I don't think, oh no, and the signaling part, yeah. So for the signaling part of QE, I think that thankfully we have this great research agenda paper by Haddad, Morera, it's on this, actually, it's still there, and Muir, where I think it's that they are just plain and simple. They have the right framework, that's it, just use it. Everything is a plan. There is no such thing as a temporary intervention. There is no such thing as a temporary QE. Everything is a plan. If you announce something, people are going to think of it as how it plays out over the years. They're going to think about states of the world in the future where you're going to redo that policy. Everything is a plan. There is no such thing. So that's it. And so therefore, if you announce something, it is always going to have this big signaling effect. And it could be good or bad. Often, if it's well done, it's good. In fact, the whatever it takes was a prime example of that. But you have to think about the trade-off, because there is no free announcement of, I'm going to do it for a week and then I'm going to stop. No, that doesn't exist. Okay, I think that's it, no? So maybe second round of.
Okay, so there was still one question.
Thanks for the speech. One more question. I agree that publishing a harsh results together with a message of no policy action is not going to be optimal. Generally, it's kind of the supervisory equivalent of shouting the end is nigh. And actually, it might be difficult to commit to take no policy action if you publish a harsh result. But assuming that's not possible, could it be still optimal to? Could it still be optimal to perform the stress test even if no policy action is taken? Because otherwise, you can get into bad dynamics. So what's the point of not performing the stress test in that situation? Kind of hoping that the bad banks kind of get subsidized by the good banks in the sense that the market perceives the average, but if this average is very low, maybe it's still the best option to execute the test to show the market that there are some good institutions. So I don't know, I guess what are your final thoughts on when you have not many policy options, what is the best time to do or not to do the test? Thanks.
Yeah, no, but I think maybe I need to clarify that. A stress test, there's stress test in peacetime and stress test in wartime. A stress test in wartime, I call that an asset quality review. Because you are in a bad scenario and you just want to figure out how bad it is, okay? You're not trying to be very forward-looking or very creative. So that one is always going to be a tool in the toolbox, no question. So if you end up in a situation where the things are bad and you need to reassure the market, doing an asset quality review, which is like a mini stress test, I think that's totally, of course, that's going to be part of it. I'm more thinking of stress tests in peacetime. Because what happened over the history of since 2010 is initially, so first of all, the first wartime stress test was successful in the US, which is why it became popular and stuff like that, okay? And eventually we did the same in Europe. But now when you move to stress testing in peacetime, initially there was an information content in the thing that you could see the stock prices moving in response to the publication of the result. But that died out very quickly. Today it's fully predictable. So the baseline scenario today is just another way of setting the capital requirement. And by the way, I'm not against it. I think it's a pretty good way to do it. But there is no information in there. The day you release the result, there is zero information content. Nobody cares. The market don't move. Nobody is learning anything. Okay. So, but it's still a good way to set the capital requirement. Okay. But it is not an information acquisition exercise. To acquire information, you need to have another scenario or two where you can ask questions that are not realistic, in the sense that they are not part of the plausible set of stuff that's going to happen over the next year. So you would never use this scenario to set capital requirements, but you can still learn from them. And so what I'm advocating is that these scenarios are the ones where we need to be a bit more creative, and I think it's going to be hard to be creative if the scenarios are fully designed in-house, because then they become like a signaling device and they become a political nightmare. So outsourcing some of it could be useful.
Okay, so Denise?
She's going to bring the mic.
I was just wondering, in all this, how do you see the bail-in options? Bail-in instruments, and whether governments can commit to, if they raise enough bail-in instruments, if they can enforce that, can they commit to no bailout? You know, it all comes down to taxpayer money or the industry money at the end of the day, but how does it fit with your thinking?
They are very useful that I don't have time to cover. Bail-in and clawbacks. And they are very tightly connected, obviously. You can think of a bail-in instrument as a way of clawing back returns to the investors. So these are always going to be useful. They are great for incentives, they are great for taxpayer. So in terms of my, all the things I described, they would, to me, they would be part of the good, like they would be like good micro tools. If you can claw back money earned by traders, by CEOs, by everybody, if you can bail in some investors, that's going to be good for incentive, good for taxpayer. But it will never add up to the full macro insurance. And I would go even further. I think it shouldn't, in the sense that it's still the case that the government, it's cheaper for the government to provide catastrophe insurance. It's still going to be true no matter what. So, in other words, if you were to force the size of all the bail-inable stuff to be big enough that it would cover your creative, not the adverse scenario, the creative severely adverse. I mean, for instance, take COVID. That's another, COVID also, obviously. Great example where in COVID, absolutely, you can buy asset as much as you want. There is no problem, no more hazard, and it's a great thing to do. But like say COVID, for instance, you know, in a shock like that, you need the government. There is nowhere, if you were to make sure that the private sector has enough fund to cover like something like COVID power 2 with some even worse virus, I mean, that won't happen. So I think that the clawbacks and bail-ins and all these tools that you have, they are great, but I think they don't negate the fact that we're still going to need the balance sheet of the government as a backstop at some point. So I just want to be able to use that efficiently. That's what I'm trying to do.
Okay. So I think we call it a day. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you. It has been a very long day. Thanks to the keynote. It has been a very nice talk. We see each other tomorrow at 9. And
now we're going to drink.
Now, yeah. Thank you.